Hey y'all, I'm Hope. Welcome back to my channel. Today I've got some fall book recommendations for you because this is my favorite time of year. You should be seeing this actually on the fall equinox, so I can officially say happy fall. And I'm just so excited that we're finally into my favorite time of year, and I just want to talk about some of my favorite things to read during this season. So for me, the fall has a few associations. I typically think of like classics during this time. I really like to pick up classics in the fall. I think it's just a great time to curl up with a good classic and enjoy it and get through it slowly. I like that kind of reading in the fall. But I also think a lot of like fantasy and mystery as well. I think fantasy because it's so magical feeling and the fall just feels magical to me. And then mystery because like I don't necessarily want something scary. So I should mention this list is going to be entirely not horror books, not spooky books. This is going to be my other fall recommendations. There is a spooky book recommendation book video coming, but this one is just going to be basically like my more generic fall recommendations. But back to mystery, I really like these kind of mystery novels that are focused on just like finding the clues, interviewing people that are just like a pure mystery in the fall. I don't know how to explain that because I also love horror, but like when fall comes around, I just want to settle in with like a really good mystery story. So those are kind of like the genres that I think of. And then the other thing that I think of in fall is kind of this specific mood that's kind of cozy, or not even necessarily cozy. I think a better word for it would be quiet, which is to me something that's like, it's not got a lot of action. It's much more about like characters, character relationships. Maybe there's a mystery and it's being kind of solved slowly through actually like looking at the clues, peeling apart the inconsistencies, interviewing people. Just these books that are kind of quieter, calmer. There's not action, there's not gore in the same way that you would have with like a thriller or a horror book. And just these things that are kind of quiet and reflective. I think that to me fall is like a very reflective season, and I like that in the books that I read during the season. So those are the kind of things that I think about for fall. So all of the books I'm going to mention here kind of fall into those categories / moods. I can never go through fall without mentioning my two favorite classics because these are to me like peak autumnal reading, and those are The Picture of Dorian Gray and Frankenstein. These are, I think, on the spookier side of classics. They are horror adjacent, but I wouldn't say that either of these books is particularly scary, which is why I'm including it here and not in my like spooky books video. I think these are much more like atmospheric and introspective. So The Picture of Dorian Gray is about this guy named Dorian Gray who accidentally sells his soul when he like proclaims to a painting that's just been painted of him that he wishes that the painting could grow old while he remains young forever, and accidentally makes that happen. And this is about his kind of descent into debauchery. Not really madness, but debauchery. Like, he kind of starts to realize that he's staying young and he can just get away with whatever he wants because the outside appearance of him is never going to match the kind of internal conflict or internal evil that he starts to cultivate. And it's just an interesting look at what that kind of privilege does to him, of this ability to stay young and stay beautiful without showing external signs of his actual behaviors, and also the social fallout of those decisions. I think it's just a really fascinating story, and it does have a, somewhat intense ending, but it's just a really interesting reflection on kind of excess in Dorian's life. Similarly, Frankenstein is basically just about Victor and the emotional, mental fallout of his decision to create a monster. He creates a monster and then his life completely falls apart, and it's about the way that Frankenstein thinks about this and the way that his own actions exacerbate the situation. So it's very much a Frankenstein-focused story. And I think it's really interesting because I think if you look even the slightest bit past Frankenstein, I actually wrote a paper on this, but if you look even the slightest bit past Frankenstein, you start to realize that he is the center of all of his problems. And I think it's just an interesting like character study of Frankenstein. And the parts with the monster are really interesting. I think this is a fun story as well, but it's also fairly like grim and dreary without being like full-on horror. I think it's just kind of introspective, a little bit scientific. It's actually one of the earliest science fiction books, so we can thank Mary Shelley for that, and I think it's just a really fun and interesting read. Now, if you want a classic that's a little less on the spooky side, maybe playing with some gothic stuff without being fully horror adjacent, I would recommend Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen because this is like a parody of the Gothic. This is a book that pulls on a lot of Gothic tropes and does them in kind of a silly way that kind of pokes fun at those tropes. And I think it's just a really fun read. It's much more like a comedy of manners with some Gothic elements than a Gothic story. But this one is following a woman named Catherine who loves to read. She loves Gothic stories, and she starts thinking that maybe she's living in one, and at the same time she ends up meeting this guy named Henry and his sister Eleanor and becoming friends with them, and all the while she's being manipulated by all the other people in her life and just getting kind of, you know, pushed around. And she starts to think that maybe she's living in a Gothic story, that maybe there's more to these interactions than you would see at the surface level, and she starts to kind of freak herself out and start to become frightened. And it's just such a fascinating story, but it's also just like told in a very kind of funny, silly way. I think the characters in here are really upbeat and interesting, and I think this is a really great one if you want something that like kind of plays with Gothic stuff but doesn't necessarily get like scary in any way. It just kind of like pokes fun at Gothic tropes and gives you this like fun little romance story about Catherine and Henry. This last classic I have to mention kind of pushes us towards the mystery category that I want to talk about, because I have The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I love the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan, but I think that these in particular I like for fall because they are quieter mysteries. These, if you haven't read a Sherlock Holmes story, it's very much about Sherlock like going to a crime scene, maybe looking for clues, picking at inconsistencies, and then interviewing people and kind of just kind of putting all the pieces together. It's like a puzzle game for him, and I think it's just fun to read because it is fairly lighthearted most of the time, and he's just going on these like little adventures and finding clues. It's a little bit like if you liked Nancy Drew as a kid. I think these books have the same vibe as like a Nancy Drew game, and I especially like short stories because I like something to kind of curl up with in the fall where you can just like sit down with a cup of tea, read your little story, and it's just like really cozy. I love that feeling. So I think these are great for that because they're short, they're easy to get through, but they're also just like really fun mysteries. I would also recommend, if you wanted something a little bit longer that was also Sherlock Holmes, I think The Hound of the Baskervilles is a great one for this time of year because it is a little bit on the spookier side, but it's not like scary. But I think these are just like so much fun to read in the fall. Moving from there, I want to talk about a few of my favorite kind of quieter mysteries, which both of these are by Keigo Higashino. I think he does a really good job of this, but I want to mention Malice and the Devotion of Suspect X. This one is a little bit darker. I would think that Malice is maybe my preference. If I was going to recommend you pick up one or the other, I think Malice is better. But both of these are Japanese crime stories that have been translated in the last few years, and they're so much fun, but they're also very quiet. Like, you're not going to find action, you're not going to find gore in either of these. These are both following individual detectives who are just, you know, examining a crime scene, interviewing people, very much doing the same things that Sherlock Holmes does, but without, like, the action-y parts. There is never a scene where you have, like, you know, a shootout with a suspect. That's never going to happen. You never have the kind of darker aspects I think you get with a lot of more modern mysteries where the detective gets, you know, trapped in a space with a killer. Think like The Silence of the Lambs at the end when she's trapped in the dark with Buffalo Bill. Like, you don't get those kind of moments in these stories. It's very much about the process of unraveling all of the little pieces and figuring out who done it. And I think it's just a really interesting kind of mystery. It's like my favorite kind of mystery. It's very also like Agatha Christie-esque. I could mention some Agatha Christie's here. I didn't pull any out, but like The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, that would also be a really good one where it's just kind of like there's a weird cast of characters. Poirot is kind of pulling at all the little threads and figuring out who done it. These are all kind of that variety of mystery. Malice is my favorite. This is about these two writers who were friends from like college, and one writer goes to visit the other, and shortly thereafter the other writer turns up dead in a locked room. And the only two people who were in the house were the writer, who is basically the perspective character for Malice, and the victim's wife. And so they're dealing with the situation, dealing with like their emotions about the death of this other writer, and then also kind of fielding questions from Detective Kaga, who is the central character of this series. This is the Detective Kaga mystery series, and I think that it's a really interesting version of a crime story because it is so much about just gently peeling back the layers and figuring out what's real and what's not. And I think Kaga in particular is really interesting. He's a former school teacher, and so he's kind of using that aspect of his experience to help him like forge connections with the community and find out more about the people involved with the case. And it's just really fun and interesting, but also like super calm and quiet and not particularly scary at all. Devotion of Suspect X is similar, except you go into this one generally kind of knowing who the killer is. The question here isn't necessarily who did it, but why they did it. And so I think that that is also an interesting take on this, and I like the characters in this one as well. This is a different detective. This is Detective Galileo, who is not in fact a detective at all. He's a physicist, but he is friends with a homicide detective who sometimes calls him in on cases. So he's a little more like a Sherlock Holmes-esque figure, where he's kind of brought in to consult on cases when the police can't figure it out. Okay, now we're finally starting to veer into fantasy, and I want to start with a fantasy that has a pretty significant mystery element to it. It also has like a touch of horror, but it's not really the focus of the story. So this is Strange Practice by Vivian Shaw, and this is the first book in the Dr. Greta Helsing series, following the titular character who is a doctor for monsters and the undead. And in this story, she gets a call from one of her patients/friends, a guy named Ruthven, who is a vampire, who tells her that another vampire has just turned up at his doorstep, very badly injured, and Greta gets involved in figuring out how he got hurt, and ends up finding connections between the attack on Varney and some other serial killings that have been taking place in the non-magic side of London. This is also set in London, I should mention that. And she gets involved in solving the case before any of her other patients turn up injured or dead. This is just... It sounds very dark, and there is like a serial killer aspect. There are also some cult aspects in this book, and I would say there are some very horror-like moments, but that's really not the focus. This is very much a found family story about Greta and Varney and Ruthven and a couple of other characters named Cranston, and I can't remember the last guy's name. It starts with an F though. It'll come back to me as soon as I'm finished filming, I'm sure. But it's about this like little group of characters that start working together to solve this mystery because they all have like different investments in the magic community. And it's just really sweet the way that they support each other. They're all like very competent, but each one, you know, has weaknesses. They have certain strengths, they have certain weaknesses, and they really rely on each other to supplement those weaknesses and take care of each other. And the way this little friendship group forms and becomes like a little family is just so sweet and comforting. And I think these are just like really fun characters to follow. And I think this is a great one if you want like a touch of horror and a little bit of mystery, but also just some really great cinnamon roll characters and some really great like family dynamics. The next one, I don't really quite know how to explain why it feels like fall to me, and I think it's mostly that it's a really introspective story. There's a little bit of action here, but it's not a lot of it. This is Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee, which I read, I want to say back in like March or April. But this one is a fantasy story following Esther, whose family was torn apart by a manticore attack, and now she has gone on to become a rooker who basically hunts manticores with the help of these giant birds of prey called rocs. And it's really about Esther finding purpose after grief, and then also about what do you do when your purpose has been taken away from you. And it's just a really like interesting character study, introspective story about Esther and her growth after this pretty horrific event that happened when she was a young woman. And I think it's just a fascinating story, and it does have a little bit of action. There are some hunting scenes because she is a manticore hunter, so there are some like intense action scenes. But there's also just a lot of great little character moments and moments where Esther is maybe learning a little bit more about herself. And I think it's just like really not comforting in the same way that like Strange Practice is comforting, but quiet in an interesting way. The last three recommendations I have here are all high fantasy, and I'm going to try and talk quickly about these because these are books I could talk about all day long. These are some of my all-time favorite books. But the first one here is The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison, which follows Maya, who's a half-goblin, half-elf, who unexpectedly becomes the emperor of the Ithuvraz, which is the elf empire. This is a story about a very dark world where things are bad, and then somebody comes to power who cares very deeply about the people, who cares about everyone, not just the wealthy or the people who like support his rule. And he tries so hard to, one, figure out how to be a ruler because he's not been prepared for this, and two, he tries so hard to use his position of power for good and to make improvements to people's lives and to consider everyone and not just the wealthy elite of his country. And it's such a sweet story. It is in some ways very sad. It's also very dark. There's some pretty messed up things that happen in here, But I think ultimately I would describe this, and I've described it this way before, as the like escapist fantasy of having a ruler who cares about the people that he rules and who wants the world to be a better place. And so I think that despite all the darkness in the world, this is a very cozy story, and it's one that I like to reread every like summer to fall because it just gives me like warm, cozy feelings, and I love the way that this book ends on this like really hopeful note. So I am going to set this aside now instead of talking about it endlessly, but these last two that I have to mention are spin-offs from that because these follow Thara Kelleher, who is a detective who shows up in The Goblin Emperor, and he has his own little spin-off series that currently consists of The Witness for the Dead and The Grief of Stones. He has, in this story, moved to a little small town called Amalo, and he gets involved with, like, kind of the local politics. He becomes a witness for the dead. That's the title of this one, which is somebody who is kind of like a death investigator, kind of works out issues when somebody's will is missing, but he has this ability to talk to the dead. Depending on how recently they've died, he can maybe ask questions. Otherwise, he might just be able to get snatches of the last things they were thinking about or feeling at the time of their death. It also depends a little bit on like how violent the death was or how slow. But he's able to get some information from people who've died. And he's using that ability to solve mysteries, to investigate homicides, also to like find wills that are missing. Or in one case, I think there's a really cute one where he's like finding a recipe, like somebody has died and their like secret recipe is missing, and the two surviving heirs are like, hey, we really need that recipe because it's necessary for us to continue operating this bakery that we own. And so it's just like little things like that. But it's got these like various different mysteries, almost has like a Monster of the Week vibe to it in the way that these different mysteries crop up across the two books. Each one has kind of a central mystery that's happening, but it's kind of interwoven with other smaller mysteries and other things that he's having to deal with. At one point, there's almost like a Witcher-esque bit where he has to go monster hunting. So there's just like all these fun little pieces in here. And again, this is a very dark world. This is still the same world of the Goblin Emperor. It's a world that just marginalizes so many people, and its hierarchy is based on oppression in so many ways. But this is another character who, in a very different way to Maya, is trying to make the world a better place. He's very devoted to justice and to truth, and he feels that it is his job, no matter what the situation, to find the truth, however much it may hurt. And I think he's just a really fascinating character, and this is, again, very introspective. It's very much about Thara Kelleher solving mysteries, but also dealing with his own trauma. He has a pretty dark backstory, and starting to like make friends, build a social network. And there's one friendship in here that is just like the sweetest thing in the world. I think it's just so charming. That relationship is so sweet and supportive, and I love these books. They just, again, they're very dark, but they're also very hopeful and cozy. And I think that these are fantastic, and given that cozy fantasy is getting kind of a moment right now, I think that more people need to be reading the Thara Kelleher books. Even if you don't read The Goblin Emperor, which I would also kind of consider to be a cozy fantasy. It's very like located in one space. There's not really a lot of action. There's like a tiny bit, but not much. It's much more political. I think these very much are cozy, and if you don't read The Goblin Emperor, I think you can still get what's going on here. The Goblin Emperor gives you a lot of like context for what's happening here, but I don't think it's necessary to understand what's happening. So those are all of the recommendations I have for you today, but I do want to real quick mention a few books that I'm actually really excited to read this fall. I'm hopeful I'll be able to get to these. I don't know if I'll get to them in October or maybe November, but I really want to get to these, and I think they're all going to be like perfect fall books. So I'll start with the classics since that's the order we went in before. I really want to read Dracula. I've never read this. It's one of the classics I have on my shelf that I haven't read, and I think it's going to be really fun and gothic and spooky, and every time I hear anything about this, it always sounds like it's even weirder than I think it's going to be. So I really would like to read this, especially because I also want to read A Dowry of Blood, and I feel like I'll get that book better if I read this one first. So I really want to read Dracula. Then I also want to try and dip my toes into a little bit of romance with the Ex-Hex. I don't really read contemporary romance, but I think that this one is one that I could like because it has some fantasy elements and a bit of like a curse or mystery element. So I think this one could capture my attention, and I had heard a few good reviews of it in the last couple of years. I bought this to read at Halloween like 2 years ago and then just ran out of time, but I do really want to get to this one this spooky season if I can. And then lastly, because everyone's been loving this book, I do really want to read Legends and Lattes, which just seems like the perfect cozy fantasy for fall. Also because they're making coffee, and like coffee is such like a warm, cozy drink. So I think this is going to be a really fun one to read this fall. And I know that there's also a sequel coming out, or a prequel coming out in November called Bookshops and Bone Dust. So I'd love to be able to read this before that one comes out, or shortly thereafter, so that I could maybe enjoy both of them. But I think this is just going to be like a perfect little cozy book for the fall. So that's pretty much all I have for you today, and I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. Maybe even you found something that you want to pick up, because I think all of these are really fun and I cannot more highly recommend any of these. But I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, I hope you'll consider giving it a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting every Tuesday and Saturday, so there is more content coming soon, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.